I want to welcome everybody here. It's this very unusual summit this year, and I appreciate you tuning in to watch this particular session, Path to Peace for Churches of Christ, Embracing an Ancient and Future Faith. This is the capstone of our pathway together, and hopefully by now you've watched the 3 videos that go along with this presentation, and what we wanted to do here at the end was just bring everybody together and have a conversation about some of these presentations. So I'd like to begin with just a few introductions so that you know who we are. With us today is Dr. Douglas Foster, one of the premier scholars of the American Restoration Movement. Some of you know Dr. Foster. He's authored numerous books on the Stone Campbell movement, including a recent biography of Alexander Campbell, which I would encourage you to brush out and get. It's very, very good. He's a longtime professor of church history here at ACU. He's my former professor. In fact, he's the one that introduced me to the history of our movement. And for that, I'm eternally grateful to Doug. Dr. Foster has offered an excellent examination of T.B. Larimore to our pathway. And the title of his speech was T.B. Larimore's Way. I will never refuse to fellowship with them. So thank you, Doug, for being with us. Also with us is Kaley Ihfe. I'm also joined by 2 of my outstanding students, I should say. And the first one is Kaley Ihfe. She is a recent graduate from ACU's Graduate School of Theology. Kaley's husband, Carl, is the preaching minister at Broadway Church of Christ in Lubbock. And I mention that because I have a great affinity for that congregation in Lubbock. I spent many years preaching there a few years ago. But Kaley is not defined by her husband's activity. Kaley has played an active role in that ministry, and she is a rising leader within Churches of Christ. Kaley here has offered a tremendous examination of the life and ministry of Selena Holman to our pathway. And her speech is entitled Learning from Selena Holman, Listening to Experience and Scripture. And finally, Nate Reiser. Nate is also a former student, and actually current student of mine here at ACU. If you've already watched Nate's presentation, you know that he lives in picturesque Camp Neotez near St. Louis, Missouri, and I believe today he's sitting out on the porch of his cabin, so you can see that scenery. It's absolutely beautiful there. His home looks nothing like Abilene, Texas, or Lubbock, Texas, where Kaley is today. A couple of years ago, Nate wrote a paper in a class that I was teaching on restoration history. And that excellent paper examined pacifism and nationalism within the history of Churches of Christ. Well, Nate was kind enough to adapt that project into a presentation for us at Summit this year. And the title of his speech is, I Pledge Allegiance to the Lord. And my name is Wes Crawford. I'm an assistant professor of church history here at ACU, following again in the footsteps of Dr. Foster. I've been teaching full-time here at ACU for just over a year, but I've been teaching online in our program, the graduate program, for a few years. Throughout my adult life, I've always had one foot in the classroom and one foot in the pulpit, simultaneously teaching and preaching. I preached at Broadway Church of Christ in Lubbock for a few years, and most recently at Glenwood Church of Christ in Tyler. I've taught church history at both Lubbock Christian University and here at ACU. And this past year, for the very first time in over 20 years, is the time when I have not been preaching every Sunday. I actually knew the pandemic would hit, and I knew preaching would be moving online, so I decided to get out while I could. That's not true. But I have wondered what it is like to be in the pulpit in these very interesting moments. And I know a lot of my friends are navigating these waters every week, and I pray for you on a regular basis. Well, as I said, I hope you've had an opportunity to watch these 3 excellent presentations given by Doug and Kaley and Nate. If you've not, I might suggest that you stop watching this video and watch the other 3 first and then come back to this one. This session is really meant to react to or respond to and reflect upon those earlier presentations. If you have watched the sessions already, you may be wondering, how do these 3 seemingly disconnected presentations belong in one single pathway? What do these 3 presentations, in other words, have in common? And how does each path Each of these presentations fit in a pathway entitled A Path to Peace for Churches of Christ. These are great questions. So allow me just a couple of minutes to introduce you to the rationale for our pathway. Last year, in 2019, Stan Gramberg and Tim Woodruff released a study on the present condition of churches of Christ. Now, from their research, they suggest that from 2006 until 2016, approximately 58 Churches of Christ congregations closed each year. Presently, they conclude that around 9 congregations are closing their doors every single month. They go on to say that Churches of Christ have lost 930 members a month for the past 18 years. But over the last 3 years, that decline has been even sharper. They estimate that we're losing about 2,000 people every single month. Now, the research also took a close look at the size of our congregations. And what they conclude is that most of our congregations are extremely small. The average attendance among the nearly 12,000 congregations associated with Churches of Christ is only 94. And over half of all congregations associated with Churches of Christ average just 34 people. Now, certainly, size is not always an accurate measure of health, but the study shows that the size of our congregations is getting smaller. And in addition to this, they found that the movement is getting older. Approximately 78% of members of Churches of Christ are now over 40 years of age. And 60% of the membership of Churches of Christ is 55 years and older. So what does all of this mean? Well, if current trends continue, by 2050, membership in Churches of Christ will decline by over 50%. Now, keep in mind, that reality assumes that the movement will continue to lose 5% of its membership every 3 years. But what if the age of Churches of Christ members factors into this analysis? Gramberg and Woodruff estimate that 5% every single year is probably more likely. So Churches of Christ consist of just under 1.2 million members today. If this new study reveals truth, that means that by 2050, this same movement will consist of only about 250,000 members. Now, as a historian of the American church and of the Restoration movement, I recognize there are at least a couple of ways to interpret these numbers. On the one hand, we could just acknowledge the elephant in the room. Churches of Christ may cease to exist in a generation or two. And as a historian of our movement, I would suggest that reality is perhaps not the end of the world. In fact, our movement began with the desire to do away with partyism and to do away with denominationalism. And if members of Churches of Christ are finding homes in the larger, non-denominational Christian world, perhaps for that we should be a bit thankful. But on the other hand, as a lifelong member of our movement, I believe that our fellowship has so much to offer the larger Christian world. And I lament these statistics revealed by Gramberg and Woodruff. I believe that our fellowship has had much to offer, and I believe our fellowship still has much to offer the world in which we live. Some have suggested that our movement has run its course. It's just time to die gracefully. Others suggest that we should just simply blend in to the larger Christian world. Well, this pathway is meant to offer perhaps a different option. Now listen, if God means to dissolve our fellowship, then by all means, God will do that with or without our help. But whether we are a thriving, growing movement 2 generations from now or not, I believe that we should engage the mission of Christ Church to its fullest. Now, if we perceive that we are not changing the world around us for good, let's consider some other possibilities. Perhaps it's time to regroup and to remember some important voices for our past. So each of these three presentations highlights a different important voice from our history. Each of these individuals stood up against the prevailing wisdom of his or her day. Each offered a voice of tremendous courage. And perhaps that's what we need to hear today, voices of courage. To be reminded that our story is filled with people who stood against long odds and who made courageous, bold contributions to the church and to the world. Whatever the future may hold for churches of Christ, maybe it's time for us to emulate the courage of those who came before us. So, Doug, I'd like to begin our conversation with you. Your paper centers on T.B. Larimore, an individual who refused to accept the division between disciples of Christ and churches of Christ. Now, I know you spent a lot of time with Larimore over the years. You quote Larimore saying, "People may refuse to fellowship with me, but I will never refuse to fellowship with them." I want you to talk to us for a minute about what might have precipitated that comment and how was it received in his own time and how did that affect him?
The comment appeared first in an article. I guess you'd say an article. It was really a response to a letter, an open letter to T.B. Larimore that had been published in the Christian Standard, which was one of the widely read papers across the churches of our movement, challenging Larimore to take a stand. Now, this is the late 1800s. The lines pretty much had been drawn in many places about who supported the issues, the main issues, that, of course, being whether or not you used instrumental music in worship, whether or not you supported a parachurch organization, the American Christian Missionary Society, in its various names, to do mission work for the churches in some sort of cooperative way. Can you do those things? There were some other smaller issues, like whether or not you could have a paid located preacher, and whether or not you could take you could use other means than the Sunday morning collection to raise funds for the church and its work. So these were all things that were being talked about. Lines had been drawn in many places already, and the tension, the heat, the division was clear. It was already beginning to happen. It was already happening. Larimore, he had established his reputation as an educator. He established a school in North Alabama, Mars Hill Academy, ran that for almost 20 years. And then as an evangelist, he had become so beloved by his students because of his personal manner, because of the love that he showed toward other people constantly. So he was all over the place doing what we would call gospel meetings. Some people might call revivals. So it's not like he was sitting off in the corner, just not saying anything. He was very much active, but he had never taken a stand on these issues. And one of his former students writes this open letter, publishes it, and says, "Brother Larimore, everybody's looking to you. Everybody respects you. Everybody wants to hear from you. You can't remain silent in this time. You need to take a stand on these issues." And so he writes this response, and he sends it to all the papers, the big papers, Christian Standard, as well as the Christian Evangelist, a more progressive paper perhaps, Gospel Advocate in Nashville. And he says, "You know, the very fact that you don't know what I believe about these things, it's not that I don't have opinions about them, but the very fact that you don't know is proof that I'm simply letting them alone. These are not things that, in my view, should be separating Christians, should be causing Christians to hate one another. And I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm not going to." He talks about, it's not the first time he's said something like this. Mm-hmm. In other places, he had said things like, "I'm not going to take a stand on these issues. I'm going to sit on them. And I'm going to take a stand on Christ." I mean, that's kind of tongue in cheek, I suppose, but he meant it. And so he makes this statement: I've written what I've written. I've said what I've said. I stand by it. I'm not going to cut off people because they take this or that position on those issues, because I don't think those are issues that are key and central. They may refuse to fellowship with me, and there were people, because he would not come out and endorse instrumental music or missionary society, who were antagonistic toward him. There were some who, because he would not openly condemn the things, that were a bit antagonistic toward him. But anybody that knew him, loved him, and knew the spirit that he had about him, he said, they may refuse to recognize or fellowship with me, but I'll never refuse to do so with them. And it's an attitude. It's an attitude that he decided to have.
Do we know, Doug, I know there are a lot of church leaders watching this, and they've been in positions where they say something or don't say something that makes it very difficult for them. Do we know how that affected him? Is there any evidence about how he reacted, or what may have transpired in his mind or in his ministry? How did this affect him?
He doesn't write about it. I mean, he alludes to some things from time to time in some of his writings, and he published a lot of articles across the spectrum, I guess you'd say, of the journals. And it hurt him. It really hurt him badly. You can kind of get a sense of it every now and then if you read between the lines. But people who knew him and wrote about him later on talked about how deeply distressed he was. Wow. In some of the archival materials that I looked at several years ago, there was a church in Bellevue, Tennessee, which is just outside of Nashville. It's part of the Nashville area today. I lived there for quite a while. And he had been there in the past. People loved him, but that church split. People were taking the different positions on the issues. And one group was wanting him to come and preach there and defend their position. The other group was wanting him to come there and preach and defend their position. And he said, and I've seen the letters. He said, it just breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. And I'm not going to come, because I can't come for the purpose of driving a wedge between these people and these people and myself. I can't be part of that. And he just talked about how deeply sad he was.
Yeah, that to me makes Larimore stand out even more. And just and during those difficult moments, but he took the hard position when it was very difficult to do that. Well, here's another question for you, Doug. As you acknowledge in your presentation, honoring Larimore's legacy does not mean that we refuse to engage every contested discussion. So how might a Christian decide which issues to vigorously engage in and which issues to ignore?
That is a very, very important question. And I would have to say this. If you had asked me that 30, 40 years ago, I would have begun to go through some sort of intellectual discussion of choices and categories and so forth. But I don't believe that anymore. And I don't think that Larimore did. I think the only way that a person is going to be able to discern that is when that person has a deep life of spiritual practices, when that person has become intimate with Christ, and has in some ways tuned into the mind of Christ that's described in Philippians chapter 2, and in immersing oneself, in my opinion, in the Gospels and trying to understand what Christ prioritized. Right. And so who did Christ prioritize? Well, it wasn't the powerful folks. It wasn't the people who were in positions of authority. It was the weak. It was the vulnerable. And so I think that as a person develops that kind of spiritual discerning mind, we need to ask, what is this action? What is this policy? What does this attitude do to those that Christ prioritized? And it always draws me to that Matthew 25, I guess it's a parable of the last judgment. And, who were the folks who were given the great reward with Christ in heaven, it was the people who gave attention to and prioritized. And I'm thinking that these are the people that Christ would prioritize. It's the people who are hungry and need clothes and drink and food. People who are in prison. People who are aliens, refugees. People who are sick and don't have access to health care. So I guess in some sort of way of saying it in a nutshell, are we individually and collectively as the church prioritizing those that Christ prioritized? Are we takers? Are we fearful and protectors of something? Or are we givers? And are we generous? And are we loving in our attitudes?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I think that's an important addition, to Larimer's legacy. I think sometimes we're tempted to say, well, look, he didn't engage in anything, so we should just stand on the sidelines with every single issue. And I don't think he would agree with that. And I certainly don't think that's a Christian posture that we should take. I think God cares about humanity. God cares about the poor and the sick and those that are oppressed and persecuted. And Christians need to have a voice there. So I appreciate you kind of adding some of those comments there. It's very helpful. Kaley, you have reminded us that Selena Holman also was a person of just tremendous courage. She advocated for a more prominent and public role for women at the turn of the 20th century, not the 21st century. Now, there are some folks who believe that the current debate about female leadership in the church is a new debate, driven by present-day American culture and politics. But you remind us that this debate is actually an old one. I know how heated this debate can get in the 21st century. So how do you think Holman was able to do it? Now we know she was vocalizing her views at perhaps the most prominent place within Churches of Christ at the time, the Gospel Advocate, and against the most prominent leader of that time, David Lipscomb. So how did she muster the strength to provide such a countercultural voice of courage on this topic over a century ago?
Well, I wish I could have interviewed her. She's so fascinating to read her letters and to read about her. But I think probably, first of all, it had to have been partly just her personality. Here's a young girl at 14 whose dad dies, and she has 4 younger siblings, including a baby brother. And so her mom can't really do much. So she starts teaching the neighborhood kids to earn money. And I say mistakenly, I think, in my presentation, because I think when I looked back over some stuff, I think I misunderstood something that she had said. So I said she taught in a kitchen. I don't think she taught in a kitchen. I think she taught at a school. So I hope whoever heard my presentation can hear my correction. But
for clarification right here.
Yeah, clarification. That's right. But it still shows, what she says, at least when she writes, I think she took the initiative to start taking these kids and teaching them, and people paid her what they could. And so we see just from this young age that she's someone who takes initiative and does what needs to be done. And the prevailing culture at the time said that this wasn't something women could do. Even in the Tennessee tradition, they really didn't believe women should even teach school, And so here you have someone who she knows she's got to do something to help her family eat. So this is what she does. And so I think personality is part of it. I think her intelligence, she's incredibly, when you read what she wrote, Absolutely. She had studied the Bible and was able to combine, she knew things. She not only knew things from all of Scripture, but she really analyzed it and looked at it and said, if Paul may have said this, but look at what these women did for Jesus. So how do I make sense of this? How do I make sense that the women were the first ones to proclaim the resurrection, to the apostles? How do I make sense of that with Paul writing in this one letter, women should be silent? So she's she really takes her time to look at scripture and analyze it. She knows history. I mean, she goes through historical times. And so I think all of that had to play into it. And I just think she had a burning desire to say, women can do this. Women can be gifted. And she would always say, this isn't for me. I don't want to be a public speaker, but there are women who can do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess we'll never know. Could she have been a public speaker in the Churches of Christ? But she sure was a great writer. I mean, she wrote a lot. So I think that played into it. I'm very curious about her marriage. I think she must have had a really great husband who, she had 8 kids with him. So, and he was an elder in the Church of Christ, and she wrote all these letters and was this really strong female leader at a time that not a lot of women felt free to do that.
Yeah, one of the things that's always stood out to me about Holman and these exchanges, especially in the Gospel Advocate, she was a highly intelligent person.
Yeah.
And so in a day and time where a lot of folks were questioning the intelligence of women, she provided this tremendous example. I mean, going toe to toe with the biblical scholars within the movement, and really, I think, exceeding them in most ways in her reading of scripture and her ability to exegete scripture is just really kind of phenomenal. And so I appreciate you unearthing her story for us. But I have another question for you. You mentioned that the exchange between Lipscomb and Holman, it may teach us something about how to disagree with one another respectfully. Certainly something that perhaps our generation needs to learn. So say a little bit more about that. What is this event, this moment, her exchange with Lipscomb and others, what does it teach us about how we should engage one another?
It's a great question. I think Holman does the best job of teaching us that. I think she really, one of the things that you notice through her letters is she assumes the best intentions of the other person. So like when she does an exchange with a preacher, I think he moved around some, but he may have been in the Ohio area, but she says, I know that everyone who is looking into this is looking for the truth, so instead of assuming that people are just out to get her or out to get women, that these men are, she says, I know everyone's looking for the truth. And then at her funeral, when they preach her funeral, she wants everyone to know you should always never say anything about someone else that you wouldn't want said about you, and so she really constantly looks for these best intentions. Lipscomb can be pretty condescending towards her in his letters, in a way that rubs really raw, I think, in today's culture. But at the same time, he is willing to publish her letters. And in our culture, what we tend to do, if we don't agree with someone, is we just don't listen to them. And so even though he is at times often condescending, he does engage her, and he never says something like, well, she's clearly doesn't believe in God, or she clearly isn't a Christian, or she clearly, he says she misunderstands scripture, but he doesn't say she can't read, she can't, and so I think something that we can learn from that today is just the idea of listening. I mean, engaging. Don't, in cancel culture, don't cancel, don't not listen, listen to other people's ideas. And then I think we learn a lot from Holman and assume the best intention. And I think those empower. If Lipscomb had maybe, I don't know that he didn't assume her best intention, but he kind of says, well, Eve was deceived. Obviously, she's also deceived.
Right.
Because women are deceived, So I think we learn we look at each other and think, where is this person coming from?
Yeah, I think you're right. Even beyond the content of what they're talking about, I think we can learn a lot about how to deal with one another. And as I said, boy, if there's a lesson that our culture, our present generation needs to learn, it's that one. because we don't engage each other well, especially when we are attempting to engage with folks with whom we disagree. And so I appreciate you bringing that up in your study. Well, Nate, let's turn to you for a moment. Your paper, to some, will be viewed as the most controversial of all three. Now, listen, I'm saying that knowing that Kaley wrote a paper about women's place in the church. So I think the reason that your paper seems so bold and so courageous and even controversial has a lot to do with the times in which we are living today, and for no other reason that we are enduring another season of election. I have to say, I felt a connection with you when you told the story about not acknowledging Pearl Harbor on Pearl Harbor Day. Years ago, when I was preaching Kaley at Broadway, I neglected to mention Memorial Day on the Sunday closest to Memorial Day while I was preaching. Well, when that sermon finished, an elderly gentleman made a beeline for me, and he just let me have it. And so, Nate, I've been there. I know what that feels like. Now, whether or not everyone agrees with your position about voting or saying the pledge or anything else, I think most everyone can agree with this. Christians today are passionate about patriotism. And I think that most would acknowledge that perhaps we are too passionate about patriotism. As a church leader, I know what it's like to preach in such a politically charged room. So Nate, what would you say here in these next few moments? What would you say to leaders within churches of Christ who are listening? How can they help their congregations keep Jesus in his proper place as king, as you say?
Well, first, I was not trying to be controversial. It is a pathway about peace, and I think honestly, the study kind of helped bring me through that process where I am at peace with Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, because you can hold your view. I'm okay. You can tell me your view. I'm okay. And I'm not going to disagree with you because I've stepped outside of the realm. It has taken too much of my time, and I guess this is what I'd like to tell leaders. It has taken too much of my time and my energy and caused too much division that I've said I'm just going to set it aside. It is not that important. God will select the next leader. God will decide who is going to run this country, and I'm at peace with that. And if that means, and I've heard this one before, that one day I am persecuted because of my faith, well, I've now gone full circle, and now I'm like a first century Christian that has to make a decision here, how much I'm going to give to the ruler of this country and how much I'm going to give to my king. And so really, I guess, thank you, Dr. Crawford, which I'm, I guess, a grandchild of Dr. Foster. Thank you for just the restoration movement and the love of it. Like you growing up in the churches of Christ, I didn't receive those lessons until I met you. And I've fallen head over heels with what Campbell and Stone were trying to say, and that is, let's set aside all of our differences, be they religious, be they denominational, and I would add, let's set aside those differences of political, so that we can come together and just be Christians only. And so that would be what I'd really want them to say is, let's just get back to being Christians and loving each other and not look for more ways that we can divide, because there are plenty of them.
Sure. Yeah, and for those that would hear your presentation and think this is a new idea, kind of like we're talking with Kaley's, this is a new idea. It's not. This has a long history within Churches of Christ, within the Stone Campbell movement. David Lipscomb, for one, who we've already mentioned, wrote a series of articles in the Gospel Advocate, which were later published into a book called Civil Government, where he, in many ways, articulates some of the things that you're saying in this presentation. And so there is a long history of this position within Churches of Christ. And I appreciate you bringing it up again for us to remind us that here was a moment where different people kind of stood out going against the grain, words of courage, words of boldness that these individuals believed needed to be heard. So I appreciate you doing that. Another question, and this is a tough one. is it possible to be both patriotic and Christian? I'm not saying it for you, Nate, but generally, how would you say this? Is it possible to strike a balance between those two things? What do you think?
Yeah, and I'll give you from my angle, and then I'll give you a quote that I really, really appreciate. So first, I still substitute at the high school, which means every morning I get to stand for the pledge.
Right.
And so I'm not going to enforce my thoughts on that to the students. I want to encourage them to be patriotic citizens. So I will stand for the pledge, and I will say a prayer silently while the pledge is going on. I coach soccer, so before every game we get the national anthem, and I stand for the national anthem, and I say a silent prayer. So I can model the action of what we're trying to encourage in young students, but I can still be a Christian within that parameter. And I'm going to give you this quote from Rick Atchley. He said it in July, I think, on a tweet. He said, "Worship only God. Be thankful for your country. And don't get those confused." And I think that's the balance. Remember who we worship, and remember who's number one, our king, our ruler. And I, during this study, I just kept thinking back to this idea that we serve a jealous God. And I remember having a girlfriend one time that I was jealous about. And when she would go talk to a boy, I would go crazy. And I was like, okay, first of all, this isn't a good relationship if I'm acting this way. But it then brought me full circle to God. And I thought, okay, God, how much am I giving to you, and how much am I giving to this country? Can we exist? Definitely. I think we can be patriotic. I think that most of our church members are very patriotic, as we pointed out, with those that want to make sure we remember the important dates. And I simply wanted to pull everybody back the other direction a little bit and say, okay, have we gone too far? Have we pulled too far to the political side, and we've lost some of what our heritage is really spoken to us, and what God is speaking to us, that he is still jealous. He still wants us to worship him only. Yeah, we can be thankful for this awesome country that allows us the freedom to worship that amazing God. But I think that's where it stops for me, and it's going to stop for each person differently. And the beauty of it is I'm okay with each one of those points for everybody. Brings a lot of peace.
I appreciate you bringing this up to us. I think it's an important thing for us to hear, especially perhaps in the time in which we're living. We could have a long discussion about why I think particularly as Americans, this is difficult for us, perhaps more difficult than any other nation in the history of the world, dealing with American civil religion and why that patriotism and nationalism is so strong in Americans, and in many cases has taken on religious qualities that in other civilizations in the past have been occupied by religion, by traditional religion, and we've attached many of those same sentiments and passions to our nation. And as you said, that's a very dangerous thing to do. It's a very, very dangerous place to go. So I appreciate you writing this paper and your presentation and showing courage of your own and putting it out there and challenging some of the social norms for today.
It's completely an honor, my friend.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking time to do this dialogue about each of your presentations, not only for your presentations that stand on their own, but for this conversation that we're having today. I wonder if you might each take time to respond to just one final question, and I'll give the same question to each of you. What is one important point from your study that you believe contemporary churches of Christ need to hear? And maybe another way to flesh this out, as we move into the future, what is one piece of wisdom that we would do well to remember? So Doug, since we started with you earlier, we'll just kind of go in that same order.
Well, drawing from the life of Larimore, since that's what I was focused on for this pathway, I think I would say that Larimore's attitude, his demeanor, his way of dealing with people, of speaking to people, of relating to people, should be the model of the way that Christians engage even those really, really important issues that we should not necessarily at all be silent about or take a no, it doesn't make any difference attitude about. That attitude that demeanor that he had was so, in my opinion, so Christ-like. I mean, it struck me, Kaley, when you mentioned Holman's funeral. She said, I want Larimore to preach my funeral because I know he won't say anything bad about me.
Wow.
Because even though he may have had views that didn't necessarily go along with all of hers, she knew that he would be a person that would focus on her goodness. And so I think the attitude, even if we have to engage, should be a model.
Yeah, that's great. Great integrity. Kaley, what's one takeaway?
I would say, to listen to voices that are saying something different than what everyone else is saying. So at least be willing to listen and engage and hear what wisdom they may have to offer, especially because their experiences are different. And so they may be able to see something that everyone else has missed, or that a lot of other people have missed. Yeah. So that's what I would say.
Nate, what's one takeaway from you?
I think I want the church to take back what we originally had, and we've kind of handed over to the government, caring for the sick, the needy, the afflicted. That was our place at one time, and we live in a government that handles a lot of those issues, and so we let them. And I would sooner the church take that back.
Wow, that's good. Well, the title of our pathway may seem a bit dissonant with these 3 papers that are contained within it. Each of these papers highlights issues or moments of extreme conflict, ideas that can spark a tremendous amount of controversy. So how can papers on unity and division, women's role in the church, and nationalism be properly situated into a pathway entitled A Path to Peace? I believe sometimes we have a misconception about peace. Oftentimes we view peace as simply the absence of conflict. Rather, true peace, shalom, it always involves conflict. The biblical concept of shalom describes a time and a place when all is as it should be. Things are, in other words, on earth as they are in heaven. Justice, right relationships, love, that's true peace. And in the fallen world in which we live, we sometimes have to pass through a great deal of contention and conflict to reach peace. But that's where God calls us to go. So I pray that God would give all of us the courage that we need to promote peace in this world and even within the church. And I pray God's Spirit would grant us protection and wisdom as we move toward that peace that often exists only on the other side of conflict. I thank you for being with us. Goodbye.